we're going to talk about how biodiversity is maintained. But before I do that, I want to give you, in this short vignette, a sense of how we assess biodiversity, how we measure it. So we're going to try to quickly confront the questions about how is biodiversity measured, how much does an individual species matter, and what is the effect of exotic species on biodiversity. So first off, measurement. Let's look at this. Okay, it's useful to be able to measure biodiversity, both to understand what resources we have, but also to compare between different ecosystems to determine which one is more diverse. There are many different ways of doing this. One of them is to assess species evenness. This is essentially looking at not just how many species are there, which we term richness, but also looking at how they are distributed. So how abundant are species? How many individuals of a species do we have in a particular place? What's good about it is it counts for rareness of species. Then kind of, let me illustrate this for you with a few different examples, but let's say that we have a community that has 10 to 1 individuals to species, and a second community has also has 10 species, but where most of them belong to most of the individuals belong to the most common species. These have the same richness, they have the same number of species, but the species are, their abundance is different, and they have a different distribution of evenness. How much does this matter? Well, it depends on what you are looking at and what you hope to maintain within an ecosystem. So let me show you a graphical illustration of this. Here, let's say this is a pretty typical example of a pinyon pine ecosystem. It's mostly pinyon pine with a few other things that are more rare. We might be able to move up in elevation to get to a system that has more species in it, and where pinyon might be less common. These might have the same richness but different evenness. So which one is more diverse? Just looking at this, you're going to say the community 2 is more diverse because it's not all dominated by one thing. That's also very helpful for you because, but for two reasons. One, this community may be more likely to maintain all of these species because they can interbreed, and there are more of them, so the system will tolerate the mortality of a single individual, as opposed to this one where mortality of a single individual would result in a loss of diversity. So basically the point of this is we need to know how many species are there, and we need to know how many of each species are in a particular community to really be able to gauge and assess its biodiversity. Okay. The other thing that I want to point out here is that individual species oftentimes have different overall importance within their system, within a particular system. They have different contributions to the structure of an ecosystem. They have different contributions to how a system functions. Here are 4 examples of that. This is a forest pigeon in New Zealand that is thought to be important for distributing seeds. Without this component of the forest, it may, certain species may not be able to persist. Go out to an old growth sequoia stand. Sequoia, it's pretty clear here, is the dominant species creating structure and biomass in these forests. Now, what's a little less obvious are things like mycorrhizal fungi, which I pointed out. Many of the trees that we care about in forests cannot persist without their mycorrhizal symbionts. But these organisms might have a lot less biomass than trees, and they are hidden from us most of the time. Yet they are essential for maintaining forest structure and biodiversity. And then there are other examples here. This is eastern hemlock. It's just extremely shade tolerant, creates its own unique forest conditions. So sometimes we might say that some of these species are keystone or foundational. They have a disproportionate control on function or composition. One of the most obvious here I would point to are the mycorrhizal fungi. Functional groups are groups of species that have similar effects on ecosystem functioning or maintaining ecosystems. And again, I would point to the mycorrhizal fungi here. There's not one species that's doing this in many forests. The same is true for things like shade-tolerant species. Oftentimes you might have more than one species that's shade-tolerant, and that interaction, characteristic of the species influences its interactions, energy flows, and recycling material. Okay, now here's a little very simple brain teaser for you. Is more always better? Here's an example from Nick Babin, focused on Clear Lake, California, and benthic fish populations. It has 13 native fish species. It now has 24 fish. So is this better? Well, many of these species are non-natives, and in fact, 5 of the native species have been driven to extinction in this system. So many of these are introduced for various reasons, and even though the system overall has greater richness, I would argue that it has less biodiversity value because we've lost these unique endemic species. Invasive species can be a real problem. They're a real problem in ecology broadly. Let's talk about what they are. There is a way that we can define them very discreetly. These are invasive species are non-native. They tend to spread and exclude other species. So that's when as always comes up in this class, students are always interested in eucalyptus in Southern California, and I've never been quite convinced that it rises to this level. It certainly excludes other species once it's established, but I don't see it spreading into other environments, into native habitat. I am not defending eucalyptus in Southern California. I'm not. Whenever I see a eucalyptus stand, the first question I always ask is, why did you do that? But I also don't think it's the worst thing that we're facing. Just always kind of seems like a mistake, but one that seems kind of inconsequential. We can discuss it. Eucalyptus is an exotic species. It's non-native, but it may or may not be invasive. But exotic species can be a problem even if they're not invasive, and eucalyptus might be one of those. Why are some species invasive? That's a really good question, and one that ecologists are trying to confront. Especially which species will become invasive, because there are many exotic species that are not invasive. They're not really even a problem. So when and why will some species become invasive? We're not good at answering that question ahead of time. We're good at answering it in retrospect, but not ahead of time, and it's a major challenge in ecology. So, all in exotic species, introduced species, they have to escape interspecific competition or interspecific competition. Oftentimes that's, when they are released from those competitive effects, they become invasive. Sometimes escape from predator diseases or herbivores is also helpful. Anyway, let's talk about a couple examples of exotic species that are damaging to forests. Exotic species do occur in forests, and many of them are innocuous. Some of them are extremely problematic, the invasive ones. Most don't matter. There are many things, especially exotic microbes. We do not know that they are in our forests until we are looking for something else that's related to them. For example, we've discovered lots and lots of Phytophthora species, these fungal species that are significant pathogens. We've found a bunch of innocuous exotic Phytophthora in the world's forests that were only found because we were looking for something else, something that was actually destructive. However, and that brings up this kind of point, many insects and microbes are capable of causing extensive mortality. And This is hemlock woolly adelgid. This is the insect here. This is an eastern forest. It's really destructive to eastern hemlock, and it changes forest structure. Doesn't convert it from forest to non-forest, but it does convert it from being dominated by a shade-tolerant conifer to a shade-intolerant broadleaf species. It's a problem, no matter how you cut it. And because I have mentioned Phytophthora morum, here's sudden oak death and another illustration of it. Why is sudden oak death a problem? Well, it kills a lot of trees, and it produces lots and lots of fuel in some of our most fire-prone and fire-problematic forests in the state. And then I'm going to return to this example about French broom, also another exotic species, and it's an invasive plant, fundamentally changes fire dynamics. It burns really hot, it creates long-lived seed bank, and it outcompetes many or most other native woody plants. So in this case, this abandoned vineyard at the seminary in San Mateo County, this system does not appear that it will reestablish as forest on its own. It's going to need some kind of management, some kind of intervention. What's going to work best? We don't know. And like so many problems in ecology, that's one that's still outstanding.